Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to begin in the 12th verse of the 17th chapter in the book of Samuel, and we're going to try and make it at least all the way up till the 52nd time pending. We do have a lot to cover here, so we're going to at least try to keep our preamble as concise as possible. In the previous passage, we read of a giant by the name of Goliath. He belonged to the Philistines, and one of the ways that ancient warfare was fought was a champion from one side would challenge the champion of other side, and that would settle the battle then and there for all intents and purpose. And this particular champion, we read, was 9 feet 9 inches in height, and he carried his body armor weighed 600 pounds, and his spear was some 15 feet and 200 pounds. So this was a literal giant, and this is a classic case of when to walk by sight and when to walk by faith. Now, in the Exodus generation, Joshua and Caleb alone were walking by faith when they investigated the Promised Land. The presence of literal giants compelled the 10 other scouts to give the cowardly course of counsel in their report based on these literal giants, and they would be there for some time. So the Philistines were of Aegean origin. They were Greek pirates who had settled in the Promised Land before the nation of Israel had come back to claim what was given to Abraham, and through him through Isaac, and through him through Jacob. So the 12th verse we read, "Now David was the son of the Ephraith of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And in the days of Saul, the man was old among men." Now, we read of these characters, we were introduced to them in the previous chapter. David is the newly anointed. Samuel had anointed the original monarch of a united monarchy. That was Saul the Benjaminite. But in the 15th chapter, we read that his disobedience, he had essentially consulted spirits, and he disobeyed a direct order from Yahweh given to him through the prophet to completely annihilate the enemy army they were with. But he was walking by sight, so he wanted to get the more profitable ransom by keeping their cattle alive for their use, and also keeping their king alive to gain a bargain. And Jesse is the father of the newly anointed. He was a resident of Bethlehem, and in the previous scene, we witness him present all 8 of his sons to the prophet Samuel, who passes each over in succession until he reaches the final one, David. And I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, 1 Samuel 16. I do believe I only went up to the 13th voice, but I did record it as that for the YouTube search engine. "And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse went. They had gone to follow Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the second, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah." We also meet these characters. They had been passed over when presented to him in that order. So we read that Jesse's 3 eldest sons were of the age to fight in the military fight. They were called to fight. They were of age for conscripted service in the military. "And David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul." So David was the 8th. The 3 oldest were old enough to be in the army, and they were among them who were cowering to the taunts of this giant who said, "Give me a man, any man, and if you beat us, we'll be your servants forever," and vice versa. But the one who was calling that issued a tremendous sense of fear in all of the members of Yahweh's people. So it came upon an outsider of that army to deliver them and defeat the Philistines, and that is David, the young boy. "But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. He was a shepherd by vocation, and as we read, he had confronted lions and bears and killed them because he had a heart for his sheep, and he was not going to let them be devoured by carnivorous predators. And by the same token, as the shepherd of Israel, he did not want to see them devoured by giants, literal giants in the form of this Philistine. And for 40 days the Philistine drew near, morning and evening, and took his stand. Then Jesse said to his son David, "Please take your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp." So Goliath earlier read that he was taunting, and we read some of the contents of that taunt, but we read here that it was a 40-day period, so he had taunted them for this whole time, and he was striking terror in their hearts, so much so that they were immobilized from action. They were not responding to a taunt which demanded a retaliatory response, and David was the one who was going to give that to him and deliver the nation of Israel from their fears and lead them on to triumph over this military enemy. So Jesse instructs his son, or sends him away to feed his brothers, because an army must march, and they had been standstill for 40 days. They were in a stationary location close enough to Bethlehem where he could go and deliver the goods that his father had instructed him to deliver. And take these 10 cheeses to the commander of the 1,000, and see how your brothers are, and bring back news of them. So he was sent to, as a messenger, or as a courier, to communicate between the sons and their father. The father would have been concerned for the well-being of his 3 eldest sons, and the youngest son was sent to instruct him. But as we read, he notices the cause which is stimulating the immobilization and the inert response of the nation of Israel, and he rectifies that and remedies it personally. For Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning, and left the sheep with the herdsmen, and took up and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight, and they shouted for the battle. So he obediently complies. He's an obedient son, and as such he is obedient to his heavenly master, and his calling, he did not take it lightly. He had proven himself the power to have the power of Yahweh at his command and his disposal when he killed the carnivorous predators, the lions and bears who had threatened his sheep, and now he was going to prove that power publicly for all to see. And Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the keeper of the supplies, and ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. As he was speaking with them, and saw the champion of the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, and David heard. So Goliath was from Gath, which was a town and Philistine of the Philistines, and he was the one causing them to not fight, because his threats and his taunts were too much for them to bear. They stimulated great fear in them, as we read. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, ran from him and were in great fear. So they were paralyzed and crippled by the sensation of fear. And fear and faith, no more than man can serve 2 masters, can fear and faith simultaneously dwell in the same vessel at the same time. They are opposites, and there is no balance or possibility of mixture between them. We either have fear or we have faith. It's seriously that simple. So we are called to situations which require courage, and a lot of the giants that we have to fight, which are metaphorical for perhaps temptations, which are invisible in themselves, that's going to require us to walk by faith all the same, because the enemies we can't see, we have to perceive through the eyes of faith, much as David assessed this situation. Now, the armies of Israel, they were walking by sight. They saw this 9'9" giant and thought he was too much. But as Jonathan, the son of David, made known in the 6th verse of the 14th chapter, the size of the enemy is of no consequence to Yahweh. He dwarfs our most giants. But he and all the Israelites were paralyzed by fear at this moment in time. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? For he has come up to reproach Israel. And it shall be that the man who smites him, the king is going to enrich him with great riches, and give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption in Israel." So Saul wanted this man dead, but he didn't have the courage or the stomach or the strength to do it. So he's offering hefty rewards in the form of marriage to his daughter, which would have grafted one into the royal family tree, and exemption from taxes and rewards of great treasure and riches. David wasn't motivated by any of that per se. He had a passion and was on fire with that passion for the name of Yahweh, and he knew that what was happening was bringing no honor to Yahweh and shame to his people, and that is something he personally rectified and resolved himself. And David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, What shall be done for the man who smites this Philistine, and shall take away reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should reproach the armies of the living Elohim? So David is making his thoughts known to army. These are hardened men seasoned by battles. He was a boy in shepherd cloths, so he had no military training, yet he renounced and rebuked the spirit of fear which was coming among these seasoned professionals who did not have the strength, did not know the strength that he knew as a shepherd in order to deliver them and defeat the enemy. And the people answered him according to his word, saying, This is what is done for the man who smites him. And Eliab his oldest brother heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's displeasure burned against David, and he said, Why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So Eliab is Jesse's firstborn and David's eldest brother. David is the youngest of 8. And the seeming head of that flock was accusing him of neglecting the sheep. He didn't know that he had been sent by Jesse himself, and he did, in fact, send a steward to watch the sheep while he was gone. And he accused him of pride and evil, of wanting to see the excitement of the battle, but there was no battle because of fear. And David said, Now what have I done? Was it not but a word? And he turned around from him toward another and said the same word. And these people answered him, a word like the first word. And when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul and sent for him. So these bold and courageous claims eventually draw him to the king himself. The king, remember, is looking for any volunteer at all to slay this giant. And he is so desperate that he ultimately entrusts or sends this 14-year-old without training he convincingly compels him to send him. He says that he will, it is not by his own strength, not by sword and shield, but by the strength of Yahweh that I will emerge victorious over this enemy who is taunting you and striking fear into you that is unacceptable and unbecoming of the covenant and chosen nation. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant is going, and shall fight with this Philistine. So David has the mind of the shepherd. He knows that there is fear in the hearts of his sheep, and he identifies himself as a servant to his king. He always had a respect for the anointing that Paul seemingly lacked and ultimately squandered. David could not bring himself now, after the fame which accumulates after this point. David was, by all measures, a more effective warrior and as the or more proficient killer on the battlefield, and this was reflected in the songs which were sung in the streets, saying Saul killed his thousands, but David killed his tens of thousands, and but that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he a man of battle from his youth. So he's walking by sight. He's assessing the challenge and the one who offers it. He's a giant who's been training and fighting since his youth. And here's this youth with no military experience promising to defeat this giant. And he has he's rationalizing the argument against it, when if he had the faith that this young man had, there would be no argument against it. Then David said to Saul, "Your servant has been tending sheep for his father, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and smote it, and rescued from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I took hold of its beard, and smote it, and killed it." So he, through the power of Yahweh and the protection of his sheep, he had killed bears and killed lions without the weapons of military. He used slingshots and knives of sorts. We read that he took it by its beard and cut it, so we can imagine that would have been a knife of some sorts. But his real weapon, the secret to his strength, was not any sword he wielded or any weapon in his hands, but the one which came above him, the one who enabled him to triumph over these enemies, and the same deity who would allow him to triumph over this giant, in the same way that he had killed praise and threats to his other sheep, the sheep of his flock, those being the literal sheep. Now he is acting as the shepherd of Israel, role he would more fully fulfill as king. So the book of 1 Samuel documents the exploits of David's pre-monarchical years, and there's a lot of stuff there that contribute to the model monarch he became. We read of his 40-year reign in the second book of Samuel. Your servant has smitten both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, seeing he has reproached the armies of the living Elohim. So his insult against Elohim's own was in fact against Elohim's himself, and the fact is that no person should survive such an insult. He was blaspheming, whether he knew it or not. He was uncircumcised, so who is he to say these things about the general of the armies of Israel, who was above him and dwarfed him? He created the universe, and here's this 9'9" pagan from the city of Gath taunting him, and who is he to get away with such audacity? And David said, "Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he delivers me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and Yahweh be with you." So he was aware that the one who had delivered him and enabled him to conquer and triumph over the enemies which were threatening his flock was Yahweh. That is an omnipotent source of strength. That is the attribute of infinite or unlimited strength, and that strength can be utilized by us through faith, and this very much belonged to David then as it would now. This is sufficiently convincing to the desperate king, who at first relents on his summons to slay this giant when he noticed that the one who's volunteering and offering it is a 14-year-old boy with ruddy hair. He was good looking, and as we read, he offers him his armor. And Saul dressed David with his garments, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and put a coat of armor on him. And David girded his sword over his garments, and began to go, but he had not tried them. Then David said to Saul, "I am not able to go with these, for I have not tried them." So David took them off. So Saul was thinking by the usual, traditional, the old-fashioned way of defeating enemies, which was by weapons and swords of might. Now, the way David would do what no sword or spear in Israel had the faith to do was through a slingshot. This was that which he had utilized to protect his sheep, and he would utilize it to slay this giant. We read that he falls face down forward upon being hit by the sling in his shot. And so a slingshot could be thought of from a military vantage point as a child's plaything, but David, through Yahweh, wields that child's plaything to accomplish a mighty witness of the power of Yahweh. And he took his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the river and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So he's not only talk at this, he draws near him, he makes himself known, he says, "I'm the one that's going to challenge you," and as we read, he gets the last word in this dialogue, and he is better at talking trash than his Philistine counterpart. And the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. Warriors in such a scenario would have been accompanied and prefaced or preceded by an armor bearer. And when the Philistine looked out about and saw David, he despised him, for he was a youth, and tanned and good-looking. So he did not have intimidating physical characteristics. He was a skinny 14-year-old boy with ruddy hair, ruddy complexion, tanned and good-looking. He did not have the makings, ostensibly, of a hardened warrior, but it was through this youth with the faith in Yahweh that Yahweh would use to conquer and defeat and send the Philistine army fleeing and the apes in response to the one he had slayed through this skinny 14-year-old pretty boy. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his mighty ones. So he disdained him, he laughed at him, and he ridicules him with the weapons that he has chosen to confront him. He asks, "Am I a dog that you come with me with a stick?" He is not an ordinary animal. He is a giant, 9'9" in stature. And he cursed him by his mighty ones. His mighty ones were non-existent. They had no power. But he cursed him, and even though he laughed at him, that would be, he was soon to find out, but it would be too late, that would be his last laugh ever, and he wouldn't be left to laugh at the one he had disdained and ridiculed and dismissed as the least likely person to take him down. When he would, that would be no more. He would never laugh again, and the mighty ones he cursed him by could not deliver his soul from Sheol, or hell. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I give your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field." So that's essentially a threat, death threat. He's saying if he does step to him, he's maybe offering him a way out, but he says, if you do step to me, I will kill you. I will assume that you are serious about this challenge, and I will treat you like an enemy, and accordingly. But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear, and with a lance, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the Elohim of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So the superior strength in this or any situation is not the weapons of man, even nuclear bombs. They dwarf in comparison to the power which Yahweh can generate seemingly on a whim. So the name of Yahweh of hosts and the power of the one to whom belongs to that name is sufficient to conquer and triumph over any weapon of man. "No weapon formed against me can prosper" is one of the promises we read of somewhere in Scripture, and this was certainly true for David, and it is true for us who are faithful and obedient and fearless in the assignments we are called to do. "This day Yahweh shall deliver you into my hand, and I shall smite you and take your head from you, and give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines today to the birds of the heavens and the wild beast of the field, so that all earth will know that Elohim is for Israel." So as a sign and a witness that the power that protected them was omnipotent, he would deliver them. He would make them worm food, essentially. They would be picked up by the carnivorous, whatever the word in nature is for one who eats carcasses, the vultures and the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field. They would feast on his flesh because he would be no more, and that would be his witness that he had triumphed and conquered him through the name of Yahweh, which he earlier claimed was his source of strength, mightier than any sword, spear, shield, or lance. "And all the assembly know that Yahweh does not save with his sword and spear, for the battle belongs to Yahweh, and he shall give you into our hands." So he knew that because the battle belonged to Yahweh, the outcome was in his hands, and it was destined that he would triumph over his Philistine antagonist, and that was because he was wholly submitted by faith to the one in whose strength he walked and in whose strength he yielded. And this little boy did what no veteran soldier or even the king of Israel could do, and that ultimately strengthened his claim to be king, because remember, he had been anointed, and it's not until here that he proves himself to be worthy of the anointing. And it came to be, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. So they had both engaged each other in violent confrontation. He had took a step towards him, and he took a step towards him. He has his sword, his 15-pound spear weighing 200 pounds. David has his slingshot, but that's going to be more than enough. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and smote the Philistine on his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So of the 5 stones he had earlier gathered, we read that it only took 1. And in some film depictions of this scene, I've seen it take at least 3. But here we read 1. It was 1, and it went straight into the center of his cranium, and that delivered a mortal blow, which caused him to fall on his face. Eventually, we read he's going to take the giant sword that the Philistine had wielded and use it against him. The lesson learned is he who lives by the sword dies by that sword. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and smote the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. So even without a sword, without a spear, without a traditional weapon of warfare, he had used this shepherd's child's plaything, this shepherd's tool, to slay the threat and the danger which had caused so much fear and consternation in the camps of the army of Israel. And it was not by might, it was not by power, but it was the strength of Yahweh through whom he prevailed. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. So the fact that he had prevailed over the, remember, the mode of ancient warfare they had entered into was, if their champion was killed, they would be defeated. And that the sight and the fact that this skinny 14-year-old boy without armor and only a slingshot had triumphed over the champion they thought no other human or mortal could triumph over, caused them to fear and flee away. So the battle, for all intents and purpose, was over then and there, when he had prevailed over the one who had challenged it. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistine as far as the entrance of the valley and the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the way to Shariah, even as far as Gath in Ekron. So he set them in motion. They would chase them and pursue them to the ends of their home. Remember, Gath was the town from which Goliath hailed. So this, by slaying him and putting his army in fleet, they pursued them all across the land. And that's as far as we're going to take it. We try to keep these absolutely under 30 minutes, but we'll give you the Cliff Notes version of what happens in the remaining chapter. Saul, the king, is curious about this young man and asks Abner, who is his lead general, who he is, and he doesn't know. He's an obscure, humble peasant boy of Jesse of Bethlehem, and eventually Saul summons him and asks him, and David identifies the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And this humble son of the servant would eventually, the anointing was upon him at this point, and it was only a matter of time before he replaced Saul as the king, and Israel was ruled by a man truly after the heart of God, as we read in 13:14, implicitly alluded to, and more explicitly in Acts 13:22. But the lesson of the story is there are choices every day of our lives. There are literally thousands of choices we must make, and in order to conquer the giants, which are the situations, the hurdles and obstacles of doing what we need to do in our assignment from God, that requires us to step out in faith and in the power and in the might of him, and that can only be accessed and utilized by faith. So I'm hoping you got something out of this. I'm here to give you the resources and equipment, or at least lead you to the one who can, to lead you to conquer and prevail over all of the giants, wherever and however and wherever they rear their ugly heads or they don't belong. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.